welcome back. Honestly, it's a pretty good time to be a Dragon fan, especially right now, because we have the Dragon Distant Counter Seal, which not only scores 300 SP, but there's no caveats to it. It's literally just Distant Counter in your Sacred Seal. I don't know why they decided to release this. If I had to guess, maybe it was the precedent with Lightning Breath, but a lot of people, as far as I knew, weren't really using it nowadays because of the cooldown penalty it granted, and it was pretty outdated even by today's standards. Like, back then it was really good, especially with Steady Breath Aether and all that, but it's definitely shown its age. Maybe that's why they brought it out, but regardless, it's been a thing, and honestly, it couldn't really hurt to invest into any regularly easily accessible dragon, just because now they have a lot more to function with, which is really nice. But even the units that have Distant Counter built into their weapon, Noe, they still have quite a bit going for them as well. As such, I figured today we would be going over the free-to-play dragons and basically ranking them accordingly, as we usually do with all the other ones. I assume this is going to be on the shorter end comparatively to the rest, because there's only like 8 dragons, but I'll find out in production because I can't see it right now. It's only it's not even that much in. But yeah, we'll be going over the easily accessible dragons, giving some build recommendations, and just a finalized ranking for both their performance and cost rating. And for anyone new to the series, I basically rank these units accordingly based on 2 ratings. There's the performance rating, which is just complete subjectivity based on how I believe they currently hold up in the meta. And then the cost rating is basically just how easy it is to invest into them on a minimalistic level if you just want to try them out. That one really doesn't matter as much if you are looking just to max invest into any of these units, so I really wouldn't worry about that one as much. It's just more for like play testing sake. But yeah, that's pretty much how we're going to go about it, and I don't really have much else to say on the introduction, so we may as well just get started with Bantu. Bantu is definitely a more modernized adult Tiki in terms of stat line. Granted, he is from Gen 3 if I remember correctly, and he is due for a refine sooner or later. But in terms of just stat allocation, they're pretty similar for the most part. He does have a bit more speed and like a tiny bit more res, but in terms of just attack and defense, they're pretty similar in that regard, and I believe he has a bit more HP. But for the most part, they're pretty much the same unit. Even like taking her PRF into account, it's not really like the craziest weapon at all. So if you are looking just to build any one of them, Bantu's probably the better approach, especially since he's less expensive overall, and will probably age a lot better considering he is due for a refund. But for now, he has Dark Breath, which is basically just attack speed smoke, and that's literally about it. Nothing too crazy. It's fine for what it is, but nothing to really write home about, especially nowadays. But as you'll see in a second, there really aren't that many Dragonstone alternatives, because we really don't have that many competitive ones in general. That being said, if you just want to use them on budget, you can keep Dark Breath, refine it for defense, and just give him quick riposte and stack up his attack and defense as much as possible. You could give him an Oath from a Kamui, you could give him attack defense form, keep his innate fear stance, promote a Klein or Tsubaki for a quick riposte, and he should be doing relatively okay, especially if he could get the debuffs off. He should be able to tank physical hits pretty well. However, if you are looking to just absolutely max invest into him, I highly recommend just making him into a melee specialist, and rather than running Dark Breath, you give him Lantern Breath, which is probably going to be one of the best defensive Dragonstones that we have in the game right now, because it not only grants +5 attack and inflicts -5 attack on the foe, but it also inflicts guard. So in terms of just getting special damage off, unless they have tempo or accelerated cooldown of some sort, they're not going to pierce through his defense, which is really convenient. But basically, the upgraded build is akin to the budget build for the most part. You're basically just upgrading the nature of the skills that otherwise would have pretty much performed the same. So attack defense unity for fear stance, Dragon's Ire for quick riposte, and joint drive attack for attack defense oath. You can still keep attack defense oath if you just want to have the consistent unity. However, that also does rely on either getting panicked or debuffed. But even with that being the case, you can still visibly buff it with other allies, which is why I don't think it's as big of an issue, and you may as well just take the extra attack. But still, comparatively to a lot of other dragons nowadays, he's definitely on the lower end of performance in my opinion. He does what a lot of other units of his kind can do, but now that we have the likes of Coral Saber and Seahorse Axe, swords and axes alike with similar stat lines, or even a bit better allocated stat lines, can run more skills and just perform a lot better in the enemy phase as a melee specialist in general. And while it's not really a fair comparison to compare a dragon to a sword or an axe, I find that in the role they find themselves in, mainly in terms of just melee specialists, they're pretty much going to be doing the same thing, which is why I would probably rank him a bit lower comparatively to any other sort of melee specialist of his kind. But still, if you just wanted to use him right out of the gate, you pretty much can, because it's pretty cheap to invest into for the most part. Next, we have female Corrin, who has another take on Dark Breath, because that's what she comes with innately. So on top of having the Dark Breath effect, she also has the Threat and Attack Speed effect, which is not really good, but it's something, I guess. And then she gets additional stats based on how many penalties are currently on the foe, which, you know what? It can work out if you can reliably debuff the foe to a consistent degree. So if you were to run maybe something like Tamari with Sabotage B, you can still target 3 of the 4 stats, which is pretty good. But even then, her stat line is just really, really bad for the most part. She has good speed and good defense, but 27 attack really isn't doing a lot for her. And 21 res means that if she wanted to go into some sort of defensive role, which she'll more than likely have to in a lot of cases, because dragons aren't really built for the player phase. Most dragons aren't, unfortunately, but they can be used in the player phase. It's just not going to be as effective as they would be in the enemy phase, mainly because they have a lot more skills to work with in that regard. But she is infantry, so she could always run no follow-up, but nevertheless, if she wanted to take advantage of stuff like Dragon Ball, she really can't, because 21 res isn't that good. And the only feasible way she'd get damage reduction is either through stuff like Flay and Elamine, or she'd have to run Speed Smoke 4, which is a bit redundant with her weapon. But even with that being the case, she can still become a pretty big stat ball, especially through the physical side. So if you just wanted to use her on budget, which may be a bit more difficult because she doesn't really have a lot of attack anyway, you pretty much can just stack as much of her attack, defense, and speed as possible. So with double form and speed defense link, she should be able to get a good amount of stats to pretty much all 3 of her more important stats. And then with Res Smoke, she can hit a bit harder, which will help her out to a good degree. Although, as I mentioned, one of the good things about being Corrin at the very least is that she does have a good speed set, so she doesn't have to run Dragon's Ire, but instead can rely on no follow-up, meaning that she can actively secure her own doubles regardless, because Dragon's Ire, while it does have impact negation, can still be shut down by the likes of no follow-up. So having the speed stat is pretty beneficial in that regard. But for a max invest build, you can pretty much just give her a menace, so it does pair with her Gloom Breath pretty well. And then you could also give her no follow-up and attack speed ideal, so that way you're basically stacking up all 4 of her stats, and then again just making her a big stat ball. Because that's kind of what you could only really do with her for the most part. Until we get more coveted dragon skills, there really isn't much going for her, but I find that, again, she really is just lacking overall. I do think with the right support, she can actually be pretty good, but that attack set is just really, really bad, and not having any good res means that she can't really take advantage of damage reduction stuff. So even if you had other speedy dragons that are infantry, you could also still run stuff like infantry no follow or infantry speed tactic, and then you could also run a different B slot. So they have more options comparatively to Corrin, which is why I don't think anything above a 5.5 is warranted. Next, we have Halloweenanna, who is also pretty generic to the likes of Bantu. She just has a way better min-max stat line, so she's dumping more speed for a bit more res, which is really, really convenient, especially if you want her to act as a mixed tank, which she can absolutely do. That on top of the fact that she just came out way later than Bantu means that she just has a lot more BSC to work with, which is really, really nice. Her weapons basically just Carrot Cujo for dragons, attack defense +5 and penalty neutralization to those stats. Not bad whatsoever. If you just want to use her on budget, you can pretty much keep her innate B slot. It's pretty good just for stacking up a bunch of defense and res as is, so that's really nice. She will want quick riposte regardless in her kit, so I would highly recommend putting that in her Sacred Seal. And then you can just grab a defense res form from a Limstella and then run attack smoke. So the idea here is basically going to definitely be relying on a bit more of the special damage for consistent damage output, because 50 attack without any of the skills included isn't exactly the highest. Although she does have good attack as is, you will want to max invest into her so she can just output a lot more consistently. But in terms of just budget, she's going to be doubled all the time anyway. So your best bet is just to bolster her bulk as much as possible so that she's just taking less and less, so that eventually she can at least retaliate with more damage, which is really convenient. And in akin to the likes of Bantu, if you do want to max invest into her, I highly recommend just grabbing Lantern Breath, because that's just a really, really good defensive Dragonstone. There really aren't that many options regardless, and the ones that we do have are also really, really limited. But -5 attack on the foe, +5 attack to yourself, and guard is pretty good. And again, you can still continue to stack up her defense and res, give her Dragon's Ire so she has consistent follow-ups, even though it will still get shut down by the likes of no follow-up. You can also give her the distant counter seal so that she can act as a mixed omni tank, which is really good. And attack smoke 4 as it not only bolsters her overall defense and res, meaning that it can pair well with Unity, but it can also shut down any sort of follow-up attack if the foe either doesn't have a guaranteed follow-up with enough speed, or they don't have no follow-up, which can just be really good for longevity purposes too. As such, I do think she's a bit better than like Bantu, mainly because she does have a way better allocated stat line, and for her role as an Omni tank, she can actually perform quite well, which is why I do think a 6 out of 10 is definitely warranted. Next we have Fa, who has a pretty okay refund. I think it aged a bit better nowadays. I remember back forever ago, I said she was like not really worth building, and I mean, to an extent, I still kind of hold that belief, but I would say with the likes of new skills that we've been getting, she's definitely aged a lot better. So her weapon basically just grants visible buffs to +5 everything if she's within 2 spaces of an ally, but it also grants it to allies as well, so it can be ran supportively. And then for her refine, it's combative. It's a weird hybrid mixed breath. I figured they just want to stick with support, but regardless, it has the Mistletoe effect and it inflicts -4 attack and res on the foe. In terms of her overall stat line, it's definitely all over the place. She has 33 attack, which is pretty decent, 46 HP, which is really high, but that's expected from a Gen 1 unit, and then 30 res, which is pretty respectable. Everything else is either just kind of workable or like really low, but you can tell for the most part it's not really allocated too well. But again, that's just the Gen 1 curse for the most part. As such, if you really just want to use her on budget, I highly recommend just making her supportive. I don't think she's really going to be performing all too well as a combat unit without any sort of like high investment. As such, I do think the best approach is support. So you give her Panic Ploy, Drive Attack, you can keep Renewal, give her HP +5, so Panic Ploy is a lot more secure. And then whatever special you really want to give her, doesn't really matter. But if she needs to enter combat, then a 2 cooldown special is easily the best approach. And as I mentioned, I did say she aged a bit better thanks to new skills, and that's due to Dragon's Wrath. Dragon's Wrath allows her to soak 20% of the damage she would be taking and retaliate back with it. And it does pair well with the Mistletoe effect, so she could always retaliate with a 2 cooldown special, meaning that her damage output's going to be really good. So you could give her Distant Storm, Joint Drive Attack, and Bonus Doubler with Noontime, so that way she could always keep her sustainability relatively high, and she could pretty much just aim for one-shots whenever possible. And honestly, I think for that reason, a 6 out of 10 is perfectly reasonable. She does pretty well. You could always run the distant counter seal if you are running low on like fodder availability, but if you are looking to just max out her damage output, you definitely want to run Distant Storm instead. And if we ever get a distant counter skill that grants attack without any sort of chip damage, akin to the likes of Distant Dart, then you may want to go down that route instead, because 5 chip damage can whittle her down to a good degree, but that's why we have Noontime. Next we have Garen, who has a pretty big amount of text for his weapon. Essentially, it just boils down to Dragon Effectiveness Nullification, +10 attack defense res, guard, and then some turn 3, turn 4 gimmick that pretty much just AoE damages foes and heals himself. That's really about it. Although I don't want to make it seem like it's nothing, because it's a pretty good defensive weapon, especially for the role he finds himself in. He's also a really min-max dragon for the most part. He has 33 attack, 33 defense, 32 res with 43 HP, and then just 22 speed, which is obviously going to be his dump stat, which for a lot of other units would probably be a bit of an issue, especially since they'd have to rely on the likes of Quick Riposte. But because he is a dragon, he has access to the likes of Dragon's Ire, which is a lot more coveted for the role he finds himself in. And most dragons, again, are really built for the enemy phase, which kind of sucks because they can only work with so much. But for Garen, at least, it does work out really well. If you want to use Garen on budget, you can pretty much keep his innate distant defense, and I would swap out his C slot and special for a 3 cooldown special and an attack smoke, so that way he could just consistently output damage every time he doubles, as well as tank whatever he needs to tank. And thankfully, because he can heal with Breath of Light, he could always just heal back up to Quick Riposte if he somehow falls below that threshold. But as such, you could also run the distant counter seal. Even on budget, I think it'll work out pretty well for him, because he does get a lot of stats, and he can inflict guard on the foe, so his tanking capabilities are pretty good as is. But also because he has access to the likes of Distant Counter Seal, he can run other competitive A slots such as Distant Defense 4, which is really good. And again, this is pretty much akin to just upgrading his base. You're basically just giving him a higher tier A skill, B skill, and C skill. I give him Moonbow instead of a 3 cooldown special for this set, mainly because if he does have to enter multiple combats, then he's not going to consistently get a 3 cooldown special off. So that's why I gave him Moonbow instead. Since again, Attack Smoke just disables any of the foe's follow-ups, but if they have no follow-up or any sort of skill like that, then it really won't matter. But regardless, any good A slot that bolsters his overall bulk with Dragon's Ire will do you really, really well. And in my opinion, he's probably one of the best dragons you could probably invest into at the moment, just because his tanking capabilities are just ridiculously good. It is basically an upgraded Lantern Breath, but also he doesn't have any sort of dragon weakness. The only thing he really just has to watch out for is Ruptured Sky, as that'll do a lot more damage to him, but otherwise, he's basically a unit with no weaknesses, which is really, really good. Next, we have Male Kana, who also got a decent refine. He basically gets Spectrum 8 and Mystic Boost, which is pretty good for what he needs to do. He's also a big stat ball akin to the likes of Female Corrin, but he has a better overall stat line on top of just more stats to work with, which is pretty good. Now, normally I don't recommend speed stacking units unless they have like really good base speed at like +0, but because he does get +8 from his weapon, you can actually speed stack him to a significant degree, and then he doesn't have to rely on the likes of Quick Riposte or Dragon's Ire, which is pretty nice. So for this set, you're basically just stacking up as much attack and speed as possible. You could also artificially bolster his bulk with the likes of Attack Smoke 3, give him an ideal noontime so he could always heal. Even though he does get healing from his weapon, having extra sustain is never a bad thing whatsoever. And Attack Speed Link just so he could get visible buffs, which is pretty good. And then for his max investment build, rather than running the Distant Counter Seal, which you can still do, I give him Distant Stance instead, so he just has better mixed bulk. And then give him Mystic Boost as his Sacred Seal, so that way he can get more sustainability after every combat, which is pretty good. And then with the likes of Dragon Wall and Pulse Smoke, you could always just give him no follow-up, but as I mentioned, you could just run no follow-up support instead. And yeah, it's basically akin to the likes of Female Corrin. You're basically just making him a big stat ball as much as possible, and it really does work out in his favor, in my opinion. Which is why, outside of Garen, I think he's also one of the better investments you can invest into at the moment. Mainly because, again, he does have a lot of stats to work with, and he just has a lot of flexibility in general. Next, we have Noe, who has a distant counter weapon with penalty neutralization and Spectrum 4. The caveat is that this was one of the earlier distant counter refines, so it has a cooldown penalty, meaning that consistently triggering specials is going to be a bit more difficult, but even with that being the case, she is infantry, so she can run stuff like Steady Breath, Darting Breath, whatever the case may be. And her overall stat line isn't bad by any means either. She is also akin to the likes of Female Corrin and Kana, as she is going to be a big stat ball, but the only difference here is that she has a free A slot and Sacred Seal, because she doesn't have to give it up for any sort of distant counter, which can be pretty convenient. As such, if you just want to use her on budget, you could really go back to the old 2018 set, stack up her stats as much as possible, give her Aether, Steady Breath, Quick Riposte, and go nuts. There's really not much else you could really do on budget with her because she does heavily rely on the merges and flower counts to just become a big stat ball. But even then, she does have penalty neutralization and she does get +4 to everything from her weapon, so she can actually perform quite well even to this day. But again, akin to the other two, she can also speed stack, so you could also run no follow-up, give her Attack Smoke 4 just for preventing faster foes without no follow-up from doubling, which can be really good. And Attack Speed Ideal, which does synergize with the Attack Smoke 4 if she could get it off, because it does grant visible buffs, which is really nice. But again, you could also just use allies that grant visible buffs anyway. And then bonus doubler so she could just become a bigger stat ball. And in my opinion, despite having the cooldown penalty, and even though we do have the Dragon Distant Counter Seal, I still think she is one of the better investments you can go into, mainly because she does have that free A and Sacred Seal, which can actually be really good for just bolstering her overall nature of a stat ball, which is really nice. The only caveat, again, is just she's going to be really expensive to build. Don't expect her performance to be like as good at +0 or +1 as it would at like Supermax investment. But that really goes without saying for like most of Gen 1, Gen 2, or even some Gen 3 units. And then finally, we have Adult Tiki, who is pretty akin to the likes of Bantu, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video. They basically have the same stat line, but the only caveat here is that she got an early refine, and it didn't really age all too great. It has Dragon Effectiveness with Renewal, and it grants Attack Defense +5. That's really it. It's not the worst, per se, but you could easily make do with a lot of better options. Especially for the role she'll definitely want to find herself in, and that's also the melee specialist role. As such, if you just want to use her on budget, you can continually stack up her attack and defense as much as possible with the likes of Attack Defense 4, give a quick riposte so she can double in the enemy phase in a good amount of instances, attack smoke so she could tank what she needs to tank, and then bonfire so she could reliably trigger heavy dealing damage on every second hit, provided that there aren't any guard effects. And then with Breath of Fog, she still gets attack and defense from it, so she can still bolster her stats quite well, especially since Lantern Breath isn't readily available. But even with that being the case, it's definitely going to be her best option because it also bolsters her res and inflicts guard on the foe. And while her res isn't exactly the highest, it can still come in clutch, especially against foes that target it, like dragons. So it's not really the worst to have whatsoever. But for the most part, she definitely just wants to prioritize taking hits on the physical side. So giving her stuff like attack, defense, unity, Dragon's Ire, joint drive attack, and steady breath, just so she can consistently have damage output while maintaining her sustainability, is definitely going to be the way to go in my opinion. But again, akin to the likes of Bantu, she's really not going to be performing much better, and he's also due for a refine soon. If anything, his performance rating will probably go up over time, while Tiki's probably going to be stuck here until they give her more competitive options. And the thing is that most dragons tend to play the same anyway as enemy phase units, which definitely hurts her niche a bit more, especially if you were to go with other units that have way better stat lines with way better PRFs. It's really going to be a bit more difficult for her in that regard. But I guess in fairness, there really aren't that many readily available dragons to play around with. So I guess if anything, she wins by just not having too much competition. But again, I would pretty much just use any other dragon. But yeah, that's pretty much it for all the dragons. Like I said earlier, there really aren't that many readily available dragons. So this was definitely going to be on the shorter end. However, I'm going to see how much it really is after I start editing it. But even with that being the case, you don't really have too many options to work with. And the best ones are still Grail locked. You can still use Noe or Fa, but otherwise, Garen and male Kana are probably going to be your best bets. But you'll have to let me know what you think down below. Do you agree with any of these? Do you think I'm being a bit too harsh, a bit too lenient with some of these? Let me know down below. And until next time, I'll see you later.